My guest tonight on Concert Night with the Dayton Philharmonic is Norman Krieger, the pianist who joined us several years ago for the wonderful weekend of Beethoven, 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 Beethoven. Much of it played by Norman. Norman, welcome to the show. It's wonderful to see you again.
Thank you, Neal. As always, it's great to see you.
We have worked together so many times over the years, and when I look back at it, that these Beethoven performances, which I think were from 2013, were the most recent time that you've been with us at the Dayton Philharmonic. So it's been like 8 years since you were with us, and now I feel guilty that you haven't been with us more recently, but we'll fix that soon.
Yeah, so it's funny. I think of all the colleagues I've collaborated with, I probably made music with you more than just about any other conductor in my life.
I think that's true.
And it's kind of ironic here now we're living just, right across the state lines in the last 4 years.
Right, we were on opposite parts of the country because for many years you were living in Los Angeles teaching at USC. Is that right?
That's right, at the Thornton School, yeah.
And then you were lured away to Indiana University, and you've been in Bloomington for several years now.
Yeah, we're going on our 5th year now. And
so how's it going? How has your life been during this COVID craziness? I hope everybody's fine and your students are well, but tell us how. I always start everybody out this way, but tell us how you've been adapting to what we've been dealing with the past year.
Well, aside from the tragedies all around the world and, losing people that we, love and admire, for me personally, it has been quite a positive shift because number one, I've been able to spend time at home with my wife and my youngest son and take walks, have conversations that enabled me not to say, well, I have an appointment at this time, now I have to go, or, run to the airport to play a concert somewhere. So for me personally, I have to confess, it's been a really, it's been very positive. I've had the time to read, to cook, to watch movies, just to contemplate things, go in my backyard and listen to the birds sing, listen to the thunder, listen to different kinds of music that I normally wouldn't listen to. And so, for me personally, it's been a chance to slow down and reflect and just focus on simple things like gratitude for health. I have taught nonstop since the pandemic began, since March 12th, 2020. My life simply switched from teaching in person to teaching online. And at first it was a learning curve because I think I had taught 1 or 2 lessons prior to that online. And so, I bought a microphone, a webcam, and became educated with this technology. At first it was a little crazy because some of the connections were not good and people would be playing and all of a sudden they were playing an andante tempo that would turn into prestissimo and then right back to andante, and I'm thinking to myself, do I comment on this or do I just accept the fact that this is what happens with technology? But it's much better now,
and plus you had, since you were working from home, you had a 14-year-old son there.
That's
who
right.
could be your IT consultant.
Absolutely. And believe me, he has been invaluable because, when I say, what's going on here? He just comes, pushes one button and it's fixed. Of course, his generation has been brought up with all this. But just from the human point of view, it's been yes, of course, it's been challenging. I miss seeing friends. But my wife and I, and my son, we would take walks with our dog, and we would see people in the neighborhood we've never seen before. At first, it was sort of like, I'm waiting for Rod Serling to show up and to do his little speech. Welcome to 2021. You're now in a situation that will change your lives forever. But eventually we start waving at neighbors that we never recognized or never knew of, and became familiar with local dogs that we never knew existed in the neighborhood. Um, and it's just, what can I say? You know, as a musician, we're probably the most blessed because we have, you know, I never stopped playing, never stopped learning. I learned a bunch of Chopin etudes over the last year. I've explored unknown music, or music that I was not aware of from the turn of the last century by Godowsky and Ignaz Friedman, a lot of less known music that used to be played more frequently during the age of, well, it's funny, you look back at 1918, that was the last pandemic. And so there's a wonderful picture of Leopold Godowsky with him wearing a mask in San Francisco during that pandemic. And that inspired me to go and do some research on his music, which is very difficult, but extremely beautiful and really educational from the pianistic point of view. So I've kept my chops up, you know, chops, of course, meaning technique, and I've been practicing, exploring, you know, different. I find that the last year has opened up a time um, sort of situation where I can explore different, read about different things, plants, cars. You know, my youngest son is obsessed with car technology, so you know, something that I never thought that I would ever have the time uh, to explore, and music becomes more meaningful. You know, you hear pieces and you realize, my gosh, you know, this could potentially be the last time I hear this symphony or this opera or ballet.
So
And
what I'm curious, what was the last public performance that you gave before the shutdown? Do you remember what it was?
actually, it was yeah, it was Beethoven's Fourth Piano Concerto
Oh wow.
in Lexington, Kentucky. Yeah, Beethoven Four. I had played it here in Columbus, um, and I was actually scheduled to record it later that spring in a live performance in Buffalo, but that of course never happened. So
So that's interesting that Beethoven, during the Beethoven year, that Beethoven was the last thing that you played. I think the last performance that I gave before the shutdown was a Pops concert.
oh,
It was a Arthur Fiedler themed Pops concert, which included, and now this is like I'm cheating on you. It included Rhapsody in Blue without
oh,
you
oh
performing.
gosh.
Piece we've done together many times. We had Gabriela Martinez as our
Oh
soloist,
yes. Well,
and
you and I recorded that in the
we did
concerto now. Yeah,
in
yeah.
Prague
In Prague, yeah, one of my favorite life events.
many years
Yeah,
ago. It
yeah.
was great fun. Now that we're starting to do performances again at the DPO, we're trying to sort of pick up where we left off with the Beethoven uh, sesquicentennial is the fancy word for it, his
Uh-huh.
250th anniversary. And we've so far, since we resumed performing either for streaming or live, we've played the Fourth Symphony, we've played the Eighth Symphony, the First Symphony is coming up, and of course on the radio show, I've gone back to many of our Beethoven performances,
Mm.
and now we're in the midst and these two weekends of hearing your concerts with us with the fourth and fifth piano concertos. So let's talk a little bit about Beethoven's Fourth because it is such a beautiful concerto, and you played it alongside this amazing violin sonata, the Kreutzer violin sonata. So since the fourth was the last piece you played in public, what does it mean to you personally? I mean, obviously it's a piece you've played many times, but
Yeah.
how do you think about that piece, and what does it mean to you?
Well, honestly, you know, this is going to sort of astound some people. Of all the five Beethoven concertos for many years, and I can't tell you why this is the case, but the Beethoven Fourth was not one of my favorite of the five. And when I say that, it's not that I didn't like it or love it or respect it, but there was something about it that was so advanced and so, you know, sort of at the highest possible spiritual level. And I finally figured it out over the last year. what about that piece was sort of a block for me. And I think this may sound funny, but when I played Mozart's piano concerti and Ravel's concertos, those two composers seemed to me to figure out the great sonic challenge of writing for piano and orchestra. When I play Ravel or Mozart, it's this perfect or blend of orchestra and keyboard. I've never experienced that with other composers, including Beethoven. I've always felt, but that's part of the, you know, the success of Beethoven. Beethoven's always struggling, trying to work through, overcome the instruments, the orchestration. There's always some kind of heroic journey with his compositional technique. But with the fourth concerto, that's delivered. That has always been delivered sort of as, I know. I think Schnabel said Mozart's music comes straight from heaven. Beethoven's always reaching for the heavens, you know. But with the fourth concerto, it's sort of it's effortless. It sort of comes from this nucleus center of creation, you know, where it's you almost feel like, well, this piece has existed in infinitum. You know, it's just there's no moment in the concerto where the orchestra and the collaboration between the keyboard and the winds and the strings has any difficulty. Of course, the second movement you have that drama between, but that's innately built into the composition itself. But finally, I figured it out. The fourth concerto is a perfect score from every standpoint, I think, of composition when it comes to piano writing with orchestral writing. The balance between the winds, the balance between the strings, and the way the keyboard evolves out of that orchestral texture is just perfect. And so I think for me personally, it sort of was recognizing or acknowledging that this is the piece where you really have the chance to relax and get out of the way and just listen. The other concerti, the first, the second, the third, the fifth, there is this element of, okay, I'm going to meet the challenge. I'm going to project my virtuosity, meaning Beethoven, you know, the way Beethoven presents the solo part in the piano. Yes, it's chamber music, but at the same time, you know that he's making a statement, especially in the first two concerti and the first three concerti, he's presenting himself to the public as a virtuoso pianist. But the fourth concerto is just one of those pinnacles, the zenith of writing, where you listen to this, and of course there's an infinite amount of possibilities in terms of tempi, dynamics, just the way the piano comes in quote unquote piano, and then the orchestra arrives in pianissimo. That in itself is so revolutionary and such a dramatic moment on stage for the audience and for us as performers.
Also, I think it's interesting in a way. It's kind of exactly what you're saying, but I'm phrasing it in a slightly different way. It strikes me that the other four Beethoven concertos are, in a way, presentational. It's about the performers performing for the audience, and the pianist playing for the audience and the orchestra supporting them. Whereas the fourth seems like it's not oriented towards the audience, but it's oriented towards the performers. It's like you're playing for us and we're playing for you. And yeah, sure, there's an audience there, but that's not what it's about. It's a piece that turns inward for the performers rather than turning outward for the audience, which makes it, in a way, kind of radical, because Beethoven's time, especially as the Romantic era was taking off, it was all about the audience and communicating to the audience. And maybe that's why it's such a special piece, because it really is, I think, unique among the five concertos, and in some ways unique among, I mean, the only other concertos I can think of that have that same sort of thing would be maybe like Liszt in the second Liszt concerto, where there are moments where it's all about the piano and the orchestra, but because it's Liszt, then there are other moments when it explodes and it's
Right.
about presenting to the
Very
audience.
true. Yeah. The canvas, if you're related to painting, that Beethoven uses in the fourth concerto is not the kind of um, oil painting, or the thickness of the oil is, it's a little bit more transparent. There's maybe some watercoloring textures, and also the stage, or the dramatic stage. When you think of Wagner, you think he enlarged the sonic stage. With Beethoven, he enlarges the stage, but as you just said, with the intimacy and with the uh, you know, uh, the word in German is, of course, is Innigkeit.
Inich, right.
The Innig, Zart, um, all the words that Schumann, of course, writes in music later on. But yeah, and also I must say, with the evolution and progression of the piano itself, on the modern piano, I think there's a greater opportunity to get closer to the core of the quality of sound that Beethoven probably had as an ideal. I mean, Beethoven was always frustrated with the piano, meaning with the instruments
Right.
themselves. And so the modern piano has, of course, uh, well, I think Horowitz said that the piano has progressed, but it has not necessarily improved. But I think in this case, the piano has improved to the point where you can create this very warm golden sound that it actually sustains longer than the pianos that Beethoven had.
Right. It's interesting. One of the things that I've been doing is, and I'm still keeping it up more than a year later, is the first day of working from home, I said, I'm going to start every day at the piano,
Oh,
which I had not done in years. And I play a little bit of Bach, and
right.
I'm almost a half hour a day. I mean, and
Wonderful.
I am still just the same bad pianist I have always been. My sight reading is a little better, but one of the things that I did is I started off working my way through the well-tempered clavier every day, a
Mm,
prelude or a fugue. And then after I did that, I did some other pieces of Bach. And then I pulled my Mozart sonatas off the shelf and I worked my way day by day through the Mozart sonatas. And then I thought I sort of took a deep breath and reached for the Beethoven sonatas
right.
and started with them. And I'm now in Opus 31, the E flat major.
Oh, right.
Um, and of course, it's awful and I can't do things up to tempo, but it's it's really interesting having done that to get a sense of the historical evolution of the piano and of the
Mm,
language from Bach to Mozart to Beethoven. And especially in those middle Beethoven sonatas, you hear how he's shedding some of the conventions of the Mozart Haydn classicism,
mm,
and you start to hear, oh, this sounds like what Schumann would be doing
right.
later,
Right.
imitating
Yeah.
Beethoven, and that
Right.
transition from the classical approach to the piano to the romantic approach, and
Mm,
the changes in texture and that exploration of the interior um, emotions of the music.
yeah.
The other thing that has struck me so much, because the piano sonatas, I know some, knew some of them, but I didn't know all of them. And I wouldn't say I know them all, but I certainly know them better.
Mm,
Um, as I've gotten old, what attracted me to Beethoven when I was younger was the rhythm and
mm.
ba 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 ba
Yeah.
and all
Sure.
that sort
Sure.
of stuff. And as I've gotten older, you start to realize, well, yeah, he did that, but he also had this great lyrical side. And now that I'm really getting older, I find so much more appreciation for the way he balances those two sides of his character and how
Mm,
even when he's in rhythmic mode, the lyricism is just around the corner and he's just waiting to get to change from one to the other. But also in the piano sonatas, there's the sort of stormy, angry Beethoven that we all know and love. But there's this also sort of playful guy who does these silly things in these pieces too. And it's just sort of so interesting to kind of how the music reflects the times in which he lived, but it also reflects the person. And you see little glimpses of who he was, and that he wasn't just the caricature of Beethoven that we all grow up with,
Mm.
but he was a much more complicated person with many different aspects that come out in his music.
I agree. I think the 32 sonatas, like the oeuvre of Shakespeare, covers just about every possible human experience you can have. Some people used to say the well-tempered clavier is the Old Testament, and the 32 Beethoven sonatas is the New Testament. Um, as for pianists, that if you can play the Chopin etudes and the well-tempered clavier, you can play anything. Well, with Beethoven, I think you have a combination of everything you just said, um, revealing many parts of his personality and genius, but he's also exploring nature and sound in such a where he's constantly pushing the envelope, and he's experimenting with the pedal. He's experimenting with the maximum amount of sound that the pianos he had were capable of, and of course, eventually begging piano builders to make them bigger, more resonant. He would say, "Oh, the string instruments, the wind instruments, they're already so connected to nature, but these pianos are just so frustrating and so limited." And so he was always pushing the piano builders to make things better. And so we owe it to Beethoven really to have the modern piano, because if Beethoven hadn't uh, been so frustrated with his instruments, we wouldn't have um, what we have today. So, but the piano sonatas are fascinating because, his work with Haydn, it was a big influence on him. But Beethoven seems to take the lyricism of Mozart, the witty mischievousness of Haydn, and yet integrate it into his own compositions and go even further, um, pushing the envelope. I find it an extraordinary. Uh, I mean, for me, Beethoven is my favorite composer. Always has been, probably always will be. The reason being is that it's not just the piano music; it's the chamber music, it's the symphonies, it's that whole journey. When you look at an opus, then you see opus 70, you see opus 70 number one, the Ghost Trio, then you see, oh, there's the Piano Concerto, there's the Emperor Concerto, there's also an E flat. There's this thread of keys of works where you can actually see how he's experimenting like a scientist in a lab with a theory and using it in so many different compositions. um, One of the craziest things I find about him is you take opus 56, which is the no opus 57, which is the F minor sonata, the Appassionata, and opus 58 is the G major concerto, and you get literally the demon and the angel right next to each other. So it's coexistence of the all the elements in the universe. It's really quite extraordinary.
In these concerts that we're rehearing, you were with us for a weekend with two different concerts on Friday and Saturday, all focused on Beethoven, including the fourth and fifth Beethoven piano concertos and chamber music, because we had the Kreutzer Sonata on Friday night and the Ghost Trio on Saturday night. So, what is it like? I mean, obviously, as a solo pianist, you're used to doing recitals where you're on stage the whole night. So I suppose these concerts were a little bit less work than you might typically do on a weekend, because at least there was an overture on each concert that you didn't play. But what is it like when you're doing Beethoven chamber music and a concerto on the same program when the whole impetus of the music is so different? What's that
Yeah.
like, turning that corner and changing those gears?
Well, it's a great question, and I will tell you what I tell my students from my own experience, and that is there is no difference between playing chamber music or in a trio or a duo or playing a concerto, because a concerto to me is chamber music on a grand scale. You have to listen, you have to breathe, you have to come to an agreement with your uh, conductor, with the first violinist. There's just as much communication going on for me as a performer in a concerto, certainly a Beethoven concerto, any of them, as there would be in the Kreutzer Sonata or the Ghost Trio. Yes, there is the intimacy of uh, less people, let's say, but to me, it's really the same. I mean, if you're playing something like the fourth concerto or the fifth concerto, you you I don't think it's possible to fall into that soloistic mode where, okay, there's my conception, and hopefully your maestro will follow you, and like it was in the old days. You listen to some of the old recordings of certain great artists from the 40s and 50s, and yes, it sounds like, I won't mention names because I love all those old performers.
Oh, come on, you can
But
you
yeah,
can say you can say you can say
well,
Glenn Gould
with
and Leonard Bernstein. It's okay.
well, they actually seemed more in sync at times than not, even with this famous speech that
Right, that Lenny gave.
Bernstein gave. Um, I, I don't know. To me, a concerto, certainly Mozart concerto, Beethoven fourth. I mean, if that's not chamber music, what is? Because you can't go off as a soloist into some kind of interpretive, universe of your own, and not, it won't sound right.
Right.
You have to be listening and collaborating. So in the Ghost Trio, I would say it's probably a bit more microscopic, meaning that the synchronization of articulation of ensemble, the dialogue is more exposed, because if your articulation is not in sync with your violinist or your cellist, sometimes that can be very interesting, but in general, we have we have to breathe together. We have to rehearse in such a way that um, I guess one might compare it. I don't know if you're singing an opera and you have a solo role, but you still have a chorus behind you. It still has to be together. It still has to sound like an ensemble. Sometimes, even if it's not together 100%, it can sound kind of cool, rather than perfectly together, depending on the work. With Beethoven, not so much so. But I find in rehearsals, the nice thing about rehearsing in a trio is you can take more time to go over passages. You can actually, if something is not sounding right, you can say, okay, let's try this again. Let's try it. Whereas with an orchestra, when you have 80 people there's only 2 hours, and we have to get, you and I have to figure out all those challenges alone, which basically takes care of 75 to 80% of what the problems may potentially be.
Right. The work convention is completely different because in a
Yeah,
concerto, you and I would get together ahead of
yeah,
time, sort of work things out, and then
right,
I'm there in rehearsal to sort of run things and coordinate.
right,
Whereas
right,
you're sitting down with a cellist and a violinist
right,
to do a trio.
yeah,
You don't have that intermediary there. It's the
right,
three of you
right.
communicating.
But I must say that many colleagues, as you know, even in a trio, the string players will meet before and they'll figure out bowings
Sure.
to save
Exactly.
time. So that a lot of, when I was younger, I remember I'd be sitting there and the violinist or cellist would say, "I'm sorry, Norman, we just have to figure out these bowings." I'm like, "Oh, it's fine. I get it. My bowings are my wrist. What goes up, what goes down." Um, um, but it's nice when they do it beforehand, and it saves a lot of time. Um, I can remember, I think you and we did Mozart C minor concerto many years. I think it was in Dayton,
I
and
think
I
you're right.
think if I remember correctly, you made a special rehearsal with me in the winds, uh, because it's basically like a wind concerto in one of the slow movements, and that saved a lot of time in the general rehearsal. I may be wrong about that, but somehow I
Yeah,
have
that
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 somewhere.
that sounds that probably sounds like it was someone else, but that's okay.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, but anyway,
Or so let's talk a little bit about the Emperor Concerto because
sure.
the fourth concerto and the fifth concerto are so very different.
Mm.
Um, what is it, and especially in the situation that we had where we're going from one night to the other, or I'm sure there are probably situations where you may have played them both on the same program.
Mm.
Um, what is it like when you make that transition from an intimate piece like the fourth concerto to this very out there piece?
Yeah.
And it has its intimate moments, but
Yeah.
it's a heroic piece. It's an E
Yeah.
flat major. It's his
Right.
heroism key.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I mean, you think of, the Third Symphony, um, certainly the Fifth Piano Concerto, the second Opus 70 trio, also in E flat. E flat is very much, and for a pianist, you're thinking you're playing E flat major in the black notes. It's a slightly awkward key, but um, the Fifth Concerto, I think, is a grounded composition, meaning the Fourth Concerto is sort of mellifluous. It's sort of in the air. It's not something that you can actually touch, really. In terms of it's sort of in the stratosphere. But the E flat Concerto, I find, it's a real tour de force
Yep.
of the instrument itself, because it's pianistically probably the first modern piano concerto, meaning it starts to really push the envelope of the piano. It's certainly in Beethoven's time, but it requires physical endurance, ingenuity, cleverness in terms of how you play double thirds, how do you play double sixths, the unison scales in the last movement. Um, I mean, the fact that the piano comes in right after the first chord of the orchestra is in itself, you know, something, but very different from the fourth piano concerto, which comes in piano first alone. Here, the piano functions, I think, as a heroic character. And the challenge with the Emperor is because of the way it's written rhythmically and pianistically. It's very dangerous and tempting to fall into this kind of Teutonic trap of rhythm, dum dum bum bee, very militaristic, and to lose the dum dum bum bee, dum bum bee, that kind of linear pulse. Um, and so I'm always conscious of wanting to overcome the martial aspect, especially in the first movement, which it sort of brings security to the orchestra if you have somebody that conducts in this very sort of old, you know, uh, uh, strict tempo. But I think it has to always move forward. And Beethoven, the piano writing is really quite amazing because he takes advantage of the whole keyboard. He goes all the way up to the upper register, all the way down. And there are some recordings, I think Horowitz, who actually adds octaves because his uh, justification is, well, if Beethoven had those octaves, he
He
would
would
have
have
used
used them.
them.
Right. Exactly.
And I can understand that. I personally don't do that because I'm uh, I don't know, a little more conservative, I guess, in certain respects. But I'm also just used to hearing them played a certain way, um, uh, and so I stick to that. The last, the last movement of the Emperor Concerto. If you listen to the Sonata Opus 81A called Les Adieux, it's in E flat, and it's basically the same character of music. It's a dance. Um, in E flat major. The last movement of the sonata, the trio, Opus 70 number 2, is in E flat, and it has very similar piano writing, a very gnarly sort of scale work. Um, so I think, who was it? Rudolf Serkin said that if you play the last movement of the Opus 81A Les Adieux Sonata, the same tempo as the last movement of the Emperor Concerto, you have the right tempo.
Hmm.
So you think, dum ti da da di da da di da 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 dum bum pi da 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 di da. Then Bum-bee-dum-ba-dum, ba-da-bee-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum. So, there is that connection. The slow movement of the Fifth Concerto, um, like many other pieces that Beethoven wrote for piano and orchestra, but in this case, the pedal is very revealing because he writes in his score to hold the pedal through the whole opening aria, which of course on the modern piano you just can't do because it'll sound like Debussy
Right.
or another composer. But it's so clever and so idiosyncratically fascinating. The transition between the second and third movement in the Emperor Concerto, where he goes from that what is it in E major, where you're in B major.
You're right, from B major to E flat major.
To E flat, and that half step, movement that he does in so many pieces. He does that in the Archduke Trio. He does that there's so many pieces. I think the Violin Concerto, in the symphonies, you've probably experienced it. And the typical Beethoven crescendo to the subito piano. I call that the Harry Potter moment, where you're at that train station where you don't hesitate, you just take your cart and you go straight to the wall.
Right.
And I that's what I talk about with my students. I said, don't give me this ta-dee-dum. No, it's
right.
Ta-dee-dum. It's like, ooh,
Right. And suddenly you think you're going somewhere else, and then suddenly you arrive somewhere completely different.
Yeah. And so, the alignment with nature, with the rules and the laws of the universe, and how temperature works, and how earthquakes happen, and how the sun rises, how storms occur. Beethoven deals with all of these fundamental elements of physical existence, and somehow, in the later works, even in the early piano sonatas, you look at the slow movements of Opus 2, number 2, or Opus 7, and I've had this discussion with many colleagues, most recently with Fima Bronfman. We were talking about the slow movement of the Hammerklavier, and he says, well, Norman, look at Opus 7. The slow movement doesn't get much deeper than some of the early works of Beethoven, chamber music, the piano sonatas, and they are just, religious in a way. They deal with all the questions of humanity, of why are we here, and it's a great guy. What a guy. We're so indebted.
Well, that's probably a wonderful place to leave that. Norman, thank you so much for sharing your music with us that we can relive through the magic of technology. But thank you also for sharing your thoughts about life and music and Beethoven. And you're right, that when you talk about Beethoven, everything comes in. Nature, life, love, art, it all comes together, and it all comes together in you. So thank you for sharing
thank you,
your music
Neal.
And your insights.
Thank you. Great to see you, and all my best wishes to my friends in the orchestra, and of course the beautiful Schuster.
We'll get you back there soon.
Yeah, I hope so. Thanks.